Are we on? Hi, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to climate change and equity as part of the Maynard's MVP 2.0 program. My name is Julie, and I'm going to do a quick introduction here and do a little bit of an overview on the MVP 2.0 program and a little bit on equity. And then Dr. Sally Warner is going to give us a lot of insight and her expertise on the latest in climate change research and answer some questions on to set us up for the MVP 2.0 program as we move forward to select a seed project. Okay. Does that work? Did that work? All right, awesome. We're doing good. Okay. So the MVP program, Municipal Vulnerability Program, MVP, is a grant program through the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or the EEA. It's a statewide grant program, and it's focused on supporting cities and towns to begin the process for planning for climate change and resiliency and implementing priority projects. Back in 2020, Maynard completed the MVP 1.0 process, which helped us to define and prioritize local climate-related hazards of concern, identify existing priorities and potential future vulnerabilities, and worked with our different town departments to really identify ways in which Maynard could be more susceptible to climate change, looking at our infrastructure, looking at our services, and all town resources. In 2024, I believe we completed the hazard mitigation plan. Is it complete? Yeah. And so the next step in this process is MVP 2.0. Through MVP 2.0, we look at all the priority actions that were identified in our previous assessments, and we look at them through the lens of environmental justice, for equity, and vulnerable populations. We've developed a core team of community and town representatives that really capture more of a wide breadth of people within our community that have different vulnerabilities, and we'll talk more about what that looks like. And we have a $50,000 grant that we get to implement focused on a climate resilience-based seed project somewhere in town. So part of this program and part of this outreach is really to set everyone up to understand what's going on, what's the latest in climate change, how is it going to affect Maynard, and how use that information to list out some potential projects that we can focus on for the $50,000 grant. Okay. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable populations. This is not a new idea, but it's something that we're really trying to adjust to in more modern grant programs, specifically through the MVP program. Maynard is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, in part because we're a small town, in part because we have dense housing, and we have a lot of infrastructure that needs to be managed. If you look at surrounding communities like Acton, there's a lot less built infrastructure that's shared among different housing. How do I want to say this? More of a rural development style, because Maynard is more of an urban development style. When we get rain, there's less place for it to infiltrate into the ground. And so we're more prone to things like flooding and stormwater impacts. We also have financial limitations as a small town. There's a smaller tax base, so there's less resources to pull from in order to invest in critical infrastructure. And we're an environmental justice community. If you're looking at the slide up in the corner there, you can see that green area in town is an environmental justice population, or an EJ population, for income criteria. And we can talk more about that, but it's one of our oldest neighborhoods in town. And so as a result, it is a qualifying factor in us being able to attain grants like this MVP 2.0 program. And how does climate change affect our community? Dr. Warner is going to talk a lot more about this, but things like the heat island effect, because we have such a lot of built space, a lot of concrete, a lot of housing, it affects the ability for our infrastructure or area to retain heat. And so as a result, the felt temperature on a high heat day is higher in Maynard than it would be in some of the surrounding towns. We also have old homes. Maynard is a very old community. And so as a result, some of our aging homes don't have proper seals and may not have insulation at all. And so the result is that a lot of homes in town will have a higher cost to convert in order to make them more energy efficient. We also have an aging population. We're an EJ community, which means we have less access to technological changes or may not be as up to speed on heat pumps and solar panels and all of the more techie side of environmental or climate change adaptations. There's also flooding throughout town, and this is something we'll hear more about in the next session. Julia Flannery is going to talk about different flooding impacts across the community, which is an issue throughout Maynard and something that does need to be addressed at more of a wide scale. And we also have stress on our critical infrastructure, water, sewer, power. Anytime we have an extreme storm, our critical infrastructure can be impacted by extreme weather events. And so these are things that we have to pay attention to as a community and prepare for. So I just wanted to give a quick overview on sustainability. I think it's an important thing to highlight because a lot of times when we're talking about sustainability, we kind of often think about the sky's the limit, we invest. And obviously, resources are limited and it's not just about economic resources, but also, how much our economic resources can have environmental impacts. And also how our investments impact our community as a whole. And so when we're talking about sustainability, we're really looking for a balancing act between impacts to our community, impacts to the environment, and the socioeconomic impacts to like the true cost of our investments. So for example, when we're talking about resilience, we're talking about a response to changing market conditions. And that's why we're looking at, how is climate change going to change our weather and our extreme storm patterns over time? Why does that matter? Because it affects our electricity and gas supply rates. It affects our cost of waste disposal. And it also, it's another reason why we have to consider aging infrastructure. On the flip side of resilience and sustainability, we also talk a lot about adaptation. So I'm giving you key terms here that sort of come up a lot in these conversations. When we talk about adaptation, we're talking about proactive planning to manage and mitigate the cost in a manner that considers future possibilities. Why are we talking about climate change today? Because the more we are aware of future changes and future impacts, the more we can prepare and plan for them accordingly. That's why things like, as we're building new buildings, we're looking at making sure there's proper air conditioned space or cooling in those buildings. That's really important because over time, our climate is going to continue to warm and our summers are going to expand, which Dr. Warner is going to talk about in a lot more detail. And the last, centering equity. One of the questions that came up as we were promoting this event was, what does equity have to do with sustainability or climate change? And this is honestly the center of the really central theme of this whole program. Climate change, any change to our environment, any change to the way we live, any change to our cost of living affects our most vulnerable populations. And that includes our aging population, includes families that have financial disparities. It includes, being able to look at climate change and its impacts through, the perspective of renters versus homeowners. Climate change also affects health. It affects people with physical limitations. It affects people with language isolation and people with limited access to transportation in a different way than it affects maybe, the average population. Other inequities that are important to look at or think about as Dr. Warner is presenting on climate change is access to resources. How are the changes to our climate going to affect people who have limited access to resources, people who have limited access to information, or people who have limited access to opportunity? And so all these things are, this whole program is about looking at yeah, we've seen what the critical infrastructure in town may experience over time, but how is it going to affect the people that live here? And how do we center the people that are most affected by climate change in a way that allows us to ensure that everyone is receiving opportunities to adapt and to change and to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so just to, drive home the MVP 2.0 program, we are in phase 2. We're currently in, I don't know, I think we're in phase number 5. We're looking at our community resilience priorities through this outreach program. And the ultimate goal within the next couple of months is to select a seed project that we will be investing our $50,000 grant money into. And so with all that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Warner, who's going to talk about climate change and take us to school, right?
Okay, sure.
Thanks, Sally.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so hi, thank you for having me here today. Let me switch the screens. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about what is climate change. And the reason I think that I was asked here is because I am a professor of climate science at Brandeis University. So I teach a whole course all about climate change, and I also teach other courses about the impacts of climate change on the ocean, and also paleoclimate, like what has happened to the Earth's climate over the Earth's history.
I know, technical.
Well, I tested it.
Today's not been our day. It's a full moon.
Okay, so where to begin? So giving a talk like this sometimes can be a little bit tough because I don't necessarily know where everyone stands in terms of their prior knowledge of climate change. So I am going to start with some of the basics. And so if you find that some of it is really a repeat for you, if you already know it, just, think about questions and think about things that you can ask me. And if I'm going far over your head, also think about questions. So I'd love to turn this into a dialogue as we go along. So hopefully I have some new nuggets for everyone. Oh, okay, this is working. Okay, so the way that I like to frame a kind of intro talk about climate change is with this, which, I can't. Okay, so with this, so this is a framing that was originally developed by Ed Maybach he's a climate communications expert at George Mason University, and he came up with the essential truth about climate change in 10 words. And those 10 words are, it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, there's hope. And so I'll go through each of those 5 lines individually and kind of give you my take on each of them. So we'll start with it's real. So this comes from, this is data, it's actually from a European agency called Copernicus, but it brings in data from all sorts of different agencies around the world. And it shows how much the temperature has warmed since pre-industrial. So while it starts off with, like we're showing data starting with the late 60s and it ends with 2024. And we see a definite trend of warming. And the numbers, the temperatures, they're compared to pre-industrial. So that's the average from like 1850 to 1900. And so one of the things that has been kind of momentous in the last few weeks is that they have released the data from 2024, which showed that 2024, the average global temperature was over 1.5 degrees C warmer than the pre-industrial average. And this was in the 2015 Paris Accords, the goal was to limit warming to 2 degrees C, ideally 1.5 degrees C. And so we have now surpassed the 1.5 degrees threshold, which is equivalent to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. You can kind of just multiply Celsius by 2 to get Fahrenheit. That's a rough way to do it, but the easiest way. So indeed, the climate is warming, and we see this with global average temperatures. Another way to look at it, we can look at this is a map. This is showing the average temperature in across the world just in 2024. And we see that some places like northeastern Canada was really, really warm during that period of time, similar to parts of Europe. But some places were not as warm during this year. But overall, we definitely see that most places were much warmer in 2024, and certainly with the average being 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial, the trend is definitely upwards. Okay, now my graph, the two graphs before, it started in the late 60s and we saw a definite warming trend. Well, what if we go way further back in time? So this graph goes back to the last ice age and we can see the temperatures. So the last ice age would have been in here. This is when it was much, much colder. Then the ice age ended and the climate warms. And then since about 10,000 years ago, we've had very steady climate. And then the Industrial Revolution happened and the climate has warmed. And the thing to take away from this is this whole period where we had really, really stable temperature, that is when human society grew. That is when we formed our cities and we formed our societies. And so you might look at this and be like, oh, wait, but okay, we've only warmed about 1.5 degrees C, whereas from the last ice age to 10,000 years ago, it warmed about 6 degrees C. That's way more, but what was around at that time? It was mostly animals. Humans were around. There were Homo sapiens, but they had a much more nomadic lifestyle. They could move. And the other thing to realize is that the rate of warming is much, much higher now. So modern warming, we're warming at the rate of about 1.2 or 0.12 degrees C per decade, whereas in this many thousand-year period after the last ice age, it warmed more, but it took thousands of years, and the rate of warming was 10 times less than the rate that we're warming now. So not only has human society developed while we've had of this very long 10,000 years of very stable temperature, and our infrastructure, our societies just can't handle the change in temperature now, but we're also warming much, much faster than what's happened previously. So one of the things I kind of want to clarify is I really prefer the term climate change to global warming. And the reason I prefer climate change is you see the two terminologies used interchangeably, but I like climate change because it encompasses the wide range of effects besides warming. So I just show graphs that show warming, but from that warming, we're going to get all these other impacts. So sure, warming, but it's not necessarily it's going to lead to more heat waves. It's going to lead to more droughts. It's going to lead to more floods and sea level rise because a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. It's going to lead to storms intensifying, like big storms like hurricanes. And those hurricanes will also be ranging further north. So here in Massachusetts, we'll be much more likely to get something like a direct hit of a hurricane because they're ranging further away from the equator, I guess. And it's causing impacts within the ocean, like ocean acidification and coral bleaching. And some other changes. So some of the other things we're observing with climate change. So both Greenland and Antarctica are losing a lot of ice mass. Greenland is actually losing more, which is crazy because it's smaller than Antarctica. It holds a lot less ice. So you can see the rate that Greenland has lost ice is with this line, with this and the squiggles are due to seasonality, and then this is the rate that Antarctica is losing ice. Land-based ice is melting, and that's causing sea level to go up. So a place like Boston, we will expect it to have anywhere from 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. So that's 75 years away, which may seem like a long time, but to protect shorelines, that takes a lot of building of infrastructure. So sea level rise while not a problem here in Maynard, we aren't close enough to the sea here. It certainly is a problem for this region, and our tax dollars will go towards some of the projects protecting Massachusetts' really, really large coastline. There's going to be biological impacts. In addition to species loss, we're also going to see species range shift. So this is the common loon. I love loons because I grew up going to a camp in New Hampshire where my mom was the nurse, and we would just hear that haunting call of the loons all night on the lake. And so what this is showing is you can see, so the 2050 and 2020 are data, and then it's showing projections into the future. And you can see the winter range is in blue, the summer range is in yellow, and you can see the loon's habitat moving further north. So there might be a really good chance that in the summer, I'm not going to be seeing the loons at my favorite lake where I grew up going. There's also going to be lots of impacts on crops and food security. And so I show here corn, but even things like we can tie, the cost of eggs is so high right now, and a lot of that has to do with the spread of bird flu. Well, climate change is making it easier for a lot of diseases to spread because they proliferate faster in a warmer climate. So there definitely can be impacts on crops and food security. And then this map, these are the weather-related disasters that hit the United States in the year 2024 that caused over $1 billion worth of damage. And so there were 27 of these events, and some were hurricanes, shown with this symbol, some were really strong storms, some were tornadoes, some were floods, some were wildfires. And you might say, okay, wait, but these are weather events. Well, that's the thing. Climate change is kind of intensifying our weather, and it's making these catastrophic events more common to happen. And so you might look at this and say, oh, but New England, there wasn't anything happening in New England. So maybe we don't need to worry here. Well, that's not to say that another year something won't hit New England. But also, I mentioned tax dollars before, but I have a friend here in Massachusetts who works for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA is not funded enough to cover all of these disasters. Homeowners insurance is now really hard to get, and you can't get flood insurance in places like Florida. And so when there's hurricanes hitting places like Florida, well, who's paying the bill? It most likely is FEMA, and then that is coming from our taxpayer dollars. So while these extreme weather events are not necessarily hitting us directly in Massachusetts, in 2024, we're still paying the bill for them. And this number is expected to increase. The number of billion-dollar disasters is only going to go up as climate change intensifies. And Julie kind of mentioned this in her intro, but we have to remember that the people who have done the least to cause climate change will be the most impacted. So climate justice is a really important way that we have to go about looking at who is impacted by climate change and how do we solve climate change. We have to make sure that we're putting the most vulnerable populations first. Okay, so climate change is real. Not only is the temperature rising, but it's causing all these other impacts, and a lot of them we've already observed. So it's us, and it is us. So just a quick primer on how greenhouse gases work. Essentially, we get radiation from the sun, and that form of radiation is what we call short-wave radiation. It's a very high energy form of radiation, and that's why we get sunburnt from the sun, is because it's very high energy. And some of that energy, it's gonna bounce off aerosols or other particulates in space. It might bounce off clouds. Some of it will bounce off light surfaces on the Earth's surface. Some will get absorbed by the Earth's surface as well. But the radiation from the sun doesn't really interact with greenhouse gases. It's coming in at the wrong wavelength. And you could think about it, what's a good analogy here? it's just able to like pass by greenhouse gases without imparting more energy to those greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, the Earth then emits radiation back to space, and that radiation that's emitted back to space is what we call long wave radiation. It's much lower energy, and I am emitting that long wave radiation right now, but also so anything that has some heat to it is going to emit long wave radiation. And that radiation is the perfect wavelength to get absorbed by greenhouse gases. And so so an analogy for greenhouse gases, the blanket analogy really works well. Some of that energy will escape to space, but the greenhouse gases really work to absorb a lot of that heat, and then they're going to re-emit that heat back to Earth. So the more we need greenhouse gases, the Earth would not be habitable without it. Our average temperature would be below 0, but by having more and more greenhouse gases, it's like we're putting a thicker blanket. We're holding in more heat rather than letting that heat escape back to space. And if we don't have a balance between the amount of heat that's coming in from the sun and the amount of heat that's leaving to space, then the Earth warms, and that's what we're seeing. So in terms of greenhouse gases, so this graph shows CO2 concentrations going back to the late 50s. They're measured on the Big Island of Hawaii at the top of Mauna Loa, which is a big volcano. And you can see the steady rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there is this sawtooth pattern, and that has to do with the amount of photosynthesis that's happening in Northern Hemisphere summer versus Northern Hemisphere winter. So there is this annual cycling, but overall there's this rising trend. And if we were to go even further back in time, so this graph goes all the way back 10,000 years, and you can see that there was this pretty steady level of greenhouse gases. And remember, those 10,000 years, that is the period of time when humanity really grew and developed, and greenhouse gases were pretty constant, or CO2 concentrations were pretty constant that entire time, which meant the Earth's climate was pretty constant that whole time. And you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, it's skyrocketed. And often we call this the hockey stick graph because it's flat, and then it curves upwards, just like a hockey stick does in this picture. And so you might be saying, okay, yeah, but there's natural sources of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And that's true. Volcanoes are definitely a natural source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. But humans are emitting 10 to 100 times more greenhouse, sorry, I should know that, but it's 100 times more greenhouse gases are emitted by humans than by volcanoes in a given year. And there's chemical signatures that we can, we know this from a number of ways, like fossil fuel companies, they tell their shareholders how much fossil fuels they're selling in a given year. So we have a pretty good idea of how much is getting burned just from that. We can also look at chemical signatures within the atmosphere. We know that the additional CO2 is mostly coming from sources that were absorbed by plants via photosynthesis. And that's what fossil fuels are. They're fossils. They're these ancient millions of years ago, some phytoplankton grew and then it died and it sunk to the bottom of a body of water. And that's where we get our oil. But that photosynthesis got its energy from photosynthesis. And we can tell there's a chemical signature that allows us to tell that indeed the excess CO2 in the atmosphere definitely comes from anthropogenic or human-derived sources. Another way we can tell is that, so climate modelers, they run these very sophisticated models that allow us to look at the Earth's climate many decades into the future, if not further. And when they run their models without anthropogenic or human sourced emissions, we see a pretty constant climate. It's shown with this green line here, whereas the observations are shown in black, and they can only get the models to match the observations if they include human emitted greenhouse gases. So it's real, it's happening, it is us, and experts agree about this. So the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they don't do their own original research. What they do is they amass research studies from all over the world, all over like scientists from all over the world studying all sorts of different things related to the climate. They compile them into these reports that come out every 5 years or so. And so the most recent came out in 2021. It was written by 234 authors from 65 countries. And in this report, they synthesize over 14,000 scientific publications. So if you really want to dive in to understand what the scientists are saying, the IPCC report is like, I would argue, is kind of like the best source for that kind of information. I will say, though, it is not particularly easy to read. So I don't necessarily recommend it unless you really want to dive into this nitty-gritty of the science. And so the 2021 was the most recent, and there were 5 okay, and there were 5 previous reports before that. Why does that keep happening? Okay. And so you might wonder, okay, but I was under the impression that scientists didn't agree on climate change, but here you say there's 14,000 studies all showing that climate change is happening. And Yale climate change communication division, or not division, but group, they do these surveys every year where they ask Americans and actually people all over the world different questions about climate change. And so when they ask people across the US, do you think global warming is happening? 72% of Americans say, yes, I agree. And actually, if you look at this map on the left, every single state, even West Virginia and Wyoming, it's over half the population agrees that climate change is happening. If you ask those same people if they believe that most scientists think global warming is happening, only 56% say that they believe scientists think global warming is happening. And so that is maybe why you might hear that, like, oh, scientists don't know what they're talking about. It's because people don't think that scientists know what they're talking about, or people don't think that scientists have agreement on this, but that's totally not true. And the reason that you might have heard these things is because there's been a very concerted effort by the fossil fuel companies to sow doubt, to spread disinformation, to delay action on climate change, to spread things like doomism, like, oh, it's too late now to do anything. And essentially they went from like, it's not happening to now it's too late. So they've really moved us into this doomism. And then there's also greenwashing, which I really wish that started with a D so that we didn't have, I could have a better alliteration on this slide, but so greenwashing is when a company or an organization says, oh, we're doing all these things for climate change and sustainability, when really they aren't doing what they say they're doing. Or fossil fuel companies saying, oh, we're researching green technology, when actually their budget to promote the fact that they're researching green technology is bigger than the actual budget for the research on the green technology. And if you want to learn more about the disinformation campaign and the doubt campaign, I highly recommend Merchants of Doubt. It's a documentary. Well, it originally was a book, but so you can read the book, but the documentary is wonderful as well. And it really goes into how the fossil fuel industry came up with its playbook to sow doubt about climate change. It is about 10 years old right now, so it is much more about the doubt story and the disinformation. It doesn't get so much into the delay and doomism and the greenwashing, which are kind of more newer tactics that are used. Okay, so it's real, it's us, experts agree, and it's bad. So it's bad, but how bad? And so one of the places that I think is really useful for us to look is in the Massachusetts Climate Assessment. So every few years, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts releases a report, the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment. I don't know why.
It's not happening on Zoom. It's
Oh.
just there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And I don't know why it like started. Sorry, everyone who's watching, the screen keeps going blank. So the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment is a statewide analysis detailing how Massachusetts people, environments, and infrastructure may be affected by climate change and related hazards through the end of the century, so over the next 75 years. And so here we are in Maynard, so we're in this eastern inland region, and that means we're gonna have effects that are actually very different from people who say are living on Cape Cod or living in Boston. And I think it is really important as we think about climate solutions to think about what's gonna be most important for us locally. And that's one thing I love about the MVP program is it's giving communities resources to do that. So if we're looking at what challenges a place like Maynard would face, so by 2030, so near term, the summer mean temperatures could increase by 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit from historical periods. So unfortunately, they're using a different historical period than what I was using before. I was saying since pre-industrial, they're actually saying since from 1950 to 2013, but essentially temperatures will continue to go up. And this is going to worsen the stress on electrical transmission and utility distribution and infrastructure. So we have an old grid, and it's really problematic because we have solutions like solar panels, but solar panels, we need to be able to send electricity and receive electricity. Back in the day, people in a home, you only would receive electricity. You never would be sending electricity out. And now we need smarter grids so that people, if they're generating electricity with solar panels, they can send that out. And then also so that, there's really innovative things, like if you have an electric vehicle, you can set it to charge at times when a lot of other electricity isn't being used. And so like the grid can do this, it can send electricity both ways, but the grid is aging and it's not as resilient as it needs to be for climate change. By the middle of the century, so by 2050, the 1% annual chance river flood could be 2 times more likely to occur. So increasing, here it says Merrimack River, but I would argue the Assabet River as well. So whereas, flooding will become about twice as likely, essentially, is what this is saying. By 2070, mid to late century, there could be 58 fewer days below freezing, increasing the chance of ticks overwintering and reducing winter recreation opportunities. So New England, it's known in the fall for its colors of the trees, and then ski season and snowboarding and cross-country skiing and all these things. Like I love in Maynard how there's it's Thanksgiving Pond, right? And it's called Thanksgiving Pond because it always had frozen over by Thanksgiving. So that's why they called it Thanksgiving Pond. You go there now and there's a good chance that it's not going to be frozen over, even in January, February, right? And so we're seeing these changes already, but things like tick-borne diseases and other diseases, that is certainly worrisome. And it's not to say that these things aren't going to happen sooner, they're just becoming more and more likely and will become more and more of a problem as climate change strengthens. And then here by the end of the century, the historical 10% annual chance daily rainfall event, so 2.8 to 4 inches, could occur 4 times more frequently. So a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, holds more water vapor. And so it means that, we are going to see a bit more like total precipitation. We'll see a bit more total precipitation in Massachusetts, but what's more worrisome than just a little bit more rain averaged over a year is we're going to be moving more to this kind of like drought deluge cycle, that there'll be longer periods where we don't get any precipitation. And then when we do get precipitation, it's going to be in these very, very large storms. And that really increases the chance of flooding. And this, I don't like, in the interest of time, I don't know if I want to, does it make sense for me to read through all of these? I don't know if it does, but I'll bring out a few highlights from this. So this is straight from that, from the Massachusetts Climate Assessment report, and just talking about some of the most urgent impacts in this region. And it's things, so vector-borne diseases, reduction in food safety and security, damage to electrical transmission, damage to inland buildings, and damage to rails, loss of rail or transit service, which taking like the commuter rail to work. It often has a lot of problems already. And so, you know, it's tough because one of the climate solutions that comes to mind most frequently for people is, oh, take more public transit. But it's going to be harder for public transit to work as climate change gets worse. Things like freshwater ecosystem degradation, like as water's warm and there's drought conditions. So a place like the Assabet Wildlife Refuge might be impacted. And wetlands are a place that store a lot of carbon. And so it's really important for us to keep our wetlands healthy, and similarly for forest health degradation. So having the Assabet Wildlife Refuge, these two, I would say, are particularly important in Maynard compared to even other places in this region. And then who's going to pay? So increase in costs of responding to climate mitigation or climate migration, increased demand for state and municipal government services. So the costs to deal with the impacts of climate change are going to go up. And then there will be other economic impacts like reduced ability to work. So if you say have a job where you're working outside in the summer, maybe you're a construction worker or something like that, heat will become an issue and will potentially make jobs like that unsafe during the hottest periods of the day. The reduction in the availability of affordably priced housing. Yeah, it is a bit of a tongue twister. It's also, you know, this is like the third lecture I've given today. So give me I'm glad we can joke about me trying to come up with the tongue twisters. But yeah, New England might be a place where we actually receive a lot of climate migrants because the southern US, like I said, it's really hard to get flood insurance if you live in Florida, and hurricanes are just going to become stronger in regions like that. Right now, populations are growing in the southern part of the US, but that might switch as climate impacts become more. And so we might be getting an influx of people, and then where do all those people live, especially if they need affordable housing? So, okay, so it's real, it's us, experts agree, and it's bad. And, you know, as we can see, there's a lot of wide-ranging impacts specifically in this region. But there is hope. And so I'll end with this section with reasons that I have hope. And I would argue that climate change is not a hopeless situation. And the reason is because, okay, so we've warmed 1.5 degrees. Sorry, I keep trying to point with my laser pointer because it's my habit, right? So we've warmed 1 degree. If we're expecting about 4 degrees C of warming by the year 2100, that's a bit on the high end of predictions, but just for rounding, it's easiest to think about 4 degrees C of warming. That's a spectrum. And so, you know, in the doubt, disinformation, doomism, doomism, that is now being used for fossil fuel industry or other people who don't want us to implement climate solutions to say, it's too late. But it's not too late. It's definitely not too late. Like there's still a lot of emissions that need to be released before we get to 4 degrees C of warming. So whatever we can do to tick that back just a little bit helps. And I think it's important to remember that all actions matter. The other thing, so this was from the New York Times. It is now about 3.5 years old, but this shows the pathway for emissions. So before the Paris Climate Accord, which happened in 2015, we were on track for these emissions. These are the current policy, and this is where countries have pledged. So like countries are not where they've pledged, but we're doing a lot better than we were 10 years ago. We're on a much better path. And places like Europe in particular, but also I would argue in places in parts of Asia, they're putting so many investments into greener infrastructure. And so it does give me hope that we are not on this pathway anymore. Obviously, it's depressing. I do think we've missed the 1.5 degrees warming pathway, but but we are not where we were 10 years ago in terms of the projection for how much emissions there would be by the year 2100. So I think it's important. I have a lot of students who come into my classes and they say, oh my God, I'm so worried about climate change and no one is doing anything. And I think it's really important to remember that while I agree 100% with that first statement, yes, I am very worried about climate change, but people are doing things, and being involved with organizations who are working to solve climate change and protect our local communities, it feels, for me, it brings me a lot of joy. Like, I get to work with really amazing people on projects, and it's a way to be involved with our communities. And a lot of climate solutions will actually make the world a better place. It will provide more equity. And so while there's a lot of work that needs to be done, people are doing it, and getting involved with that work can be really rewarding. And the other thing that's kind of exciting is there's no single silver bullet to mitigate climate change. And mitigation, I mean to stop our emissions. We also need to adapt. I can talk about that a little bit in a bit, but there's no single silver bullet. Or I also like the analogy, it takes more than one seed to plant a garden, right? So in some ways, this makes it a challenge because it means we have to do all these things. But at the same time, it kind of is exciting because there's so many things that need to be done. So everyone can kind of find their niche, their way of contributing. And one of my favorite websites for finding lots and lots of climate solutions, it's called Project Drawdown. And Project Drawdown, so it's at drawdown.org/solutions. Right now, they have 93 of the most impactful climate mitigation solutions detailed on their website, and that number keeps going up. So I usually say it's like the 100 top climate solutions. And it's everything from things like composting to things like alternative cement to coastal wetland protection. And this is just what I could take as a screenshot as the first 15. So this is showing the first 15, but there's like 78 more beyond this. So we're only getting A through the beginning of C here, and it goes all the way to the end of the alphabet. So I urge you to check out that website, and maybe you'll find things on that website where you're like, oh, I didn't know that we needed to do that. And some of them are really surprising. Like, if we think about one of the number one things that needs to be done to solve climate change, or one of the number one things that would have a big impact, is reducing food waste. And reducing food waste, that doesn't even cost anything. That saves money. And so some of these climate solutions, like something like reducing food waste, it's about education, it's about providing resources for restaurants to help reduce food waste, but that would save everyone money and help us with our food insecurity. So, or food insecurities that might come about with climate, or that will come about with climate change. So in my climate science class, I make every student pick one of these, and they do their final projects on them, and they have to find an organization who is already implementing these things. And it ends the semester on this really exciting note, because I see 35 presentations all about all these different organizations around the world who are implementing these climate solutions already. And I would argue that working on climate solutions, it empowers you to make a difference rather than feeling overwhelmed by the doom and gloom of climate change. And I urge you to create outward ripple effects with your actions. So if you can find ways to create systemic change as opposed to individual actions. So I'm not saying don't do individual actions. That's great. If you are privileged enough to be able to add solar panels to your house or drive an electric vehicle, awesome. That's great. If you want to switch to a diet that has less meat, or that you're going to reduce your food waste, that's great as well. But if you also can get involved to make changes, say on a local level or a regional level, then the actions you're doing are having impacts that are going to be bigger than just your personal carbon footprint. And so here are some ideas that I've had. So what can your community do to reduce its carbon emissions? So things like installing heat pumps, that's a great one. Massachusetts has a lot of funds and rebates for helping both individuals and larger entities do that. Installing solar panels on your house is great, but working to help put together a big solar array can be even a bigger impact. things like composting and, like I said, reducing food waste, that can be really important. Switching to a more plant-based diet. And that has to do with something like cows. I have a bit of a 14-year-old sense of humor, so I really wish it was cows farting out methane, but actually they're burping out the methane. But yeah, cows contribute a lot of greenhouse gases because they're burping up methane. Whatever we can do to eat like lower on the food chain, like plants and other non-meat products, really do have a smaller carbon footprint. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize what works for you, right? Like if you are like, nope, I really love hamburgers. Okay, eat your hamburgers, but then find a way to contribute somehow else. And that's okay. I think it's really important that we don't shame people for not living these like perfect carbon neutral lifestyles. I think that just makes people feel intimidated. Things like protecting wetlands, and this is a photo that I actually took in the Assabet Wildlife Refuge. So we have these great wetlands, and wetlands hold tons of carbon. So whatever we can do to protect them and keep them, keep that carbon in the ground is a great thing. And then helping to create laws that prevent emissions is also really important, as is voting. So then what does your community need to do to adapt to climate change? So this left-hand side is how can we reduce our emissions, but we're also going to need to adapt. We're going to need to change to make ourselves more resilient to the changing climate. So reading and educating yourself about climate. So being here today, watching this talk, hopefully this gives you some ideas. I love this book. It's called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And it's an anthology all written by female authors about all the different ways that they're working towards climate solutions. And it's everything from reducing the carbon impacts of fashion to using the judicial system to shut down coal-fired power plants and everything in between. A lot of people, especially young people, are dealing with climate anxiety. So if we can support our communities and help people with the emotions that go with climate and with a change in climate, so climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, that can be a great way to help adapt as well. Changing our electrical grid, I kind of mentioned that before, that's going to be really important for adapting. Oh, this one is showing a flood. So being prepared, preparing ourselves for floods. And in Maynard, the fact that we have a river running right through our downtown, Maynard very much is very much prone to flooding. And Mary Jo, yeah, planting trees is always great. The one caveat I'll give with planting trees is that make sure that they're planted in a place where they are going to grow and live and survive, because I think sometimes trees get planted in places like they get planted, but then no one's there to tend to them, and then they don't survive. And I think it's also really important to make sure you're planting native plants and a diversity of plants as opposed to monocultures of trees. But yes, trees are great. They soak up carbon. We will not be able to solve climate change just by planting trees, but like I said, every little bit helps, and and trees have the extra added benefit that they do things like provide shade, which is really wonderful, shade and habitat. Creating emergency plans, this can be a way to adapt so your community is more prepared when a disaster does hit. Dealing with things like tick-borne and other diseases that are going to become stronger with climate change is important. Again, using the judicial system is going to be really important to create laws that help us adapt to climate change. And then, of course, remembering that social justice has to be a really important part of this, that climate justice, the people who have done the least to cause climate change are going to be the most impacted. And so we have to make sure they have a voice and that their needs are met. I really love, this is my last slide. I really love, this is Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Her TED Talk is linked there, although You can't click on it from Zoom, but you could do a Google search for Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson TED Talk. And what she suggests when you're thinking about what your personal climate actions should be, she talks about brainstorming in these 3 buckets. What are your skills and talents? Like um, what are things that you can do that maybe other people can't do? What are the networks you're connected to? So brainstorm your skills and talents. Brainstorm what is the work that needs to be done. Are there ways that your skills and talents can overlap with the work that needs to be done? And then she also argues that it's really important for us to do things that bring us joy. And I agree with that, because if it's just like this slog and you hate doing what you're doing to help solve climate change, it's going to be really hard to do. Whereas if you can find something that brings you joy, it's going to be fun to do and it's going to be joyful to do, and you're making a difference while you're doing it. So that's what she suggests, is brainstorming in these 3 buckets and trying to find something at the intersection of them all. So in summary, climate change, it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, but there is hope. And hopefully with something like MVP 2.0, we can find some hope in Maynard to bring the community together to work on a project that will have a community-wide impact. So thank you all.
Yay.
Yay.
We have a couple of questions from online, but before
Oh.
we move to online questions, does anyone in the room have questions? Sure. Some reading questions that were submitted through our Google form. Question number 1. How do we best strengthen resilience among town residents? I think that's just more of a general question about adaptation and changing conditions over time. So do you have any general comments on advice for
strengthening resilience?
Yeah.
Like, I do think education is a really good place to start, like making sure that people understand what it looks like for climate change to happen. Because I do still think there's a lot of people out there who are like, oh, that's fine, I'll just have to shovel less in the winter. Like, I don't mind that if things are warmer. So I do think education is important. And whatever we can do to build community, like if you have like if a climate disaster, a climate related weather disaster hits Maynard, having a community, having neighbors, having people you can rely on and help you through those tough times, and like a network in place to help the most vulnerable people, especially during those times. I think that is going to be one of the most important things that we can do. And then we get to know our neighbors. So I think so education and building community, I would argue, are kind of 2 of the most important things for creating resiliency, in addition to, of course, all the other somewhat more technical things.
Yeah, I liked what you said earlier about emergency planning. And I think often when we think of emergency planning, we think of what to do in the case of a fire, but there's a lot more that we can individually prepare for in the event of some kind of weather-related hazard, such as like downed trees or loss of electricity. Like, do we have, are you prepared at home? And in the event that you need support, do you have contact with your neighbors and people local to you that you can reach out to and help?
Yeah.
The second part of this question is, resilience will include enabling people access to natural resources such as river walks and open spaces. As an example, during COVID, usage of our trails increased enormously. So I think the question is just more about talking about making sure that we are including like our community natural resources and making them accessible to people.
Yeah, and I think, here in Maynard, we are a small community, but we have a river and we have that Assabet Wildlife Refuge. And I think if there are ways that we can use those, and like I said, the wildlife refuge being filled with wetlands store so much carbon. So not only can they help mitigate climate change, but it can provide like a shady place where people can go if they want to escape heat and things like that. So if there are ways to provide more people more access to nature, I'm all for that. I think that sounds great.
There's also lots of you know, emotional benefits to being able to get outdoors and, reconnect with nature.
Yes, my students will use the term forest bathing.
Yeah.
Um,
Grounding.
So if you want to be like a 20-year-old,
Yeah.
you can go in the woods and give yourself a forest bath.
Yeah, I love it.
But that can help with your climate anxiety too.
True, it's true. The trees are still there.
Yeah.
And speaking of trees, our last question is about, and this might be a great question for our next session, Xana. But it's about whether or not there are any state level plans that you know about that are reducing impacts of potential wildfires in our area.
I am not aware of anything at the moment. We are lucky though, like obviously LA is being really strongly impacted by wildfires. I lived in the Pacific Northwest for 15 years. My parents still live in the Pacific Northwest, in an area that definitely has been impacted by wildfires. But luckily here in Massachusetts, if we like, we are gonna move more into this cycle of like drought and big storm, like I said. So we are becoming more vulnerable to things like forest fires, but we luckily aren't as vulnerable as some other places. So like when I was showing like what the Massachusetts climate change assessment was saying for this region, forest fires were not on that list, whereas certainly they'd be on the list for a city like LA or much of the western half of the country. Yeah, so I don't have a really satisfying answer. Like I don't really know what's happening with respect to preparing for forest fires, but I do know that it's not one of the climate impacts that's going to be most impactful in this region.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you pull up the last slide or my last slide?
Yeah.
And we'll just close out with the upcoming.
I wanted to say that what I really liked about your presentation was this project drawdown.
Yeah.
I kind of want anybody who's participating in these events to look at that, because it may be that our $50,000 project can come out of that, and if it's, if it's really something that's tangible and doable, I think that's great. So I'm definitely gonna look at that one and and just sort of check off to see what I'm doing and what I'm not doing, and what, are there little things that I've just kind of,
And what's so exciting about it is it helps you like brainstorm, and some of the things like, okay, high speed rail is one of them. Like, we probably aren't gonna build a high speed rail to get across Maynard, right? Like that wouldn't be our project. There's also things like clean cook stoves, which are really meant for people who are using like coal stoves in their like huts wherever they live, right? But there will be some that really would fit in Maynard. So like going through that list and kind of picking out maybe the 10 that could potentially work, that could be a great starting point for the brainstorming.
Does anyone else have any questions? Sally? Awesome. All right, so I'll close out with what's coming next. This is still so strange. What's coming next in our MVP 2.0 program. Today's event number 1, Introduction to Climate Change and Equity. Following this presentation, we will have the recording up on the town website under the Sustainability Committee page. And we'll make sure that everyone has a link to that. It'll also be on the WAVM website. Is that where all the on the YouTube, I think? We'll figure that out and we'll send it out to everyone. The next presentation is How Will Climate Change Affect Life in Maynard? And this is a panel presentation with our fire chief.
No, it's gonna be somebody from the police department, from water department, Julie Flannery, and Amy Lovelace from the senior center,
Oh, great.
and Lucas Lynn from the high school. So we're gonna have the 4 panelists who will sort of give us the overview of how the town is prepared, and what the people that are working in the town and sort of on the school side, what are we looking ahead to, and what are the things that where the gaps are. So
Awesome.
they'll be helping with that.
Awesome. That's going to be a great presentation. And so from there, we'll walk away with a bunch of different ideas and categories and potential projects that we can consider for this particular MVP 2.0 grant. And then event number 3 is a hands-on workshop where we're going to take our project ideas and really run some numbers and put some thought to, like, what would it take to implement something like that locally? And so that'll be coordinated with our MVP 2.0 project team, our liaisons, and potentially some town staff as well. Do you want to say anything else about that, Xana? And that'll be on Sunday, March 9th at 1 p.m. here in the fire department training room. Following that event, we will have a list of potential projects and we'll work with the liaison team to select a single project that we can, or potentially however many projects we can fit for $50,000. And then from there, we will have other projects that we can always apply to other grant funding sources for the future. So this isn't the only chance we have to do this kind of climate resilience work. It's just the first. And I should also say that, you know, for the MVP program, once we complete MVP 2.0, we're also eligible for much more significantly sized grants that we can use for water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, flooding protection, that kind of thing. So this is not only a benefit to our community and to residents here, it's also something that can help our infrastructure down the line. So with that, thanks everyone for attending tonight. Thanks for watching the recording if you're watching it. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to the Sustainability Committee and we'll be happy to answer those questions. Thanks. And then, all right.
Thank you.
Yeah.